Thanks for listening to the Susie Larson Life podcast, available thanks to support from listeners like you.
It's only just a matter of, it's only just a matter of, sing, so the back row is your glide, 'cause walking just won't do dance, you don't have to know how to, ever since Grace got you there.
Welcome to Susie Larson Live. Always so honored to get to spend this time with you. In fact, I look forward to bringing you conversations every single day that hopefully inspire you in your faith walk, that deepen your understanding of God's Word, and that heightens your awareness of His very real presence in your life. Well, today we're talking with one of my favorite guests about this, how our body holds on to trauma, what role we play in our own healing process. And I'm not ready to share the details yet. I'll say that I had a recent health scare that sent visceral terror through my body. It literally was a benign observation about something that's likely nothing, but could be something. That's what the doctor said. It's probably nothing, but it could be something. And my body responded before my brain had a chance to even think about it. And one of my doctors, who's a dear friend, I was talking with him about it. And he's such a man of God. He said, Susie, that's a trauma response. Doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you need more healing. So I'm moving in that direction, and God is really speaking to me about some things, some of the fears and lies that have yet remained unchallenged within me. You know, we're all a work in progress, aren't we? I know I'm not alone in this. So first of all, everyone has trauma. Some things that didn't happen for you that should have, that's a form of trauma. Some things that happened to you that never should have happened, that's another form of trauma. Then there's major trauma, major life events that deeply impact your physiology, your thinking, they imprint on your perspective. And so this is why I can't think of anybody better to talk about this today than Dr. Lee Warren, who himself has gone through what he calls the massive thing. He lost his son through just a tragic death, and he's been through other things, major things. But he's a humble, brilliant man of God. And so we're going to draw from his book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. This book, I've told him before, he's such a great writer. So if you've lost something, lost someone, he will grieve with you. I mean, the way that he writes about his grief process is so honest and raw. It reads in part like a novel. But then there's a treatment plan. Then there's a way to learn how to think again, to learn how to hope again, how to perform self-brain surgery and things like that. We'll get him on in just a moment. Quick announcement, though. Our audience is growing leaps and bounds. We've got listeners from all over the world. So if you're new to Faith Radio and even newer to the idea of a faith journey, we'd love to help you begin your relationship with Jesus. If you need some answers to some of your questions, just text the word faith to 41224. Now let me tell you about my guest. We'll get him on the show. Dr. Lee Warren's a practicing neurosurgeon and the award-winning author of several books. He talks to thousands of his closest friends daily about faith, doubt, and neuroscience on the Dr. Lee Warren podcast. His wife, Lisa, is way out of his league, he says, and his 4 grandkids have him completely wrapped around their fingers. He lives on the banks of the North Platte River in Nebraska with Lisa, his sidekick and father-in-law, Dennis, and we're so honored to have him with us today. Dr. Lee, welcome back to the show.
Susie, it's an honor to be back with you, my friend. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, looking forward to the conversation, and you've been on plenty of times enough to know that we always start every day with the same question, and it's this: what has God been talking to you about these days?
You know, it's interesting. I've been spending so much time in Romans 12, and I always seem somehow to start with verse 2, because we're always talking about, mind change, and you can't change your life until you change your mind and all that neurological stuff around self-brain surgery. So we start in verse 2, but lately I've been starting in verse 1, where you're supposed to start, Susie. And he says, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So that's the verse before he tells us to transform our minds, to change our thinking. So he reminds us that our mind is part of our body, that we're supposed to change our mind, and that's part of our essential act of worship to him. So I've been camping out in that a lot. Like, renewing my mind is an act of worship.
Boy, beautiful. That's why I asked the question. So good. Someone needed to hear that today for sure. Well, you and I have talked about this before, both your show and on my show, that God does not want us to live in perpetual fear, waiting for the next shoe to drop. And we can't control our lives to such a degree that nothing bad will ever happen to us. But there is a healthy place we can land when it comes to life's hardships. So, you say we'll always fall to the level of our preparation. So just address that in any way you feel led.
Yeah, so I got that line, actually stole that line from Chris Voss, who's an FBI hostage negotiator. I read a book that he wrote a few years ago called Never Split the Difference. And I don't remember much about that book, but that line stuck with me. And the point of it is that we have to prepare for the hard things that come along in life, because when we're under stress, we don't suddenly become some superhuman version of ourselves. We don't become Tom Brady in the fourth quarter when we're under pressure. We fall back to where we prepared. And so that's when it struck me, as I was thinking about how to put my life back together after our son died. Like what happens to people when they suffer is if they haven't prepared their minds for the fact that life brings suffering, then you can really fall apart. If you haven't spent some time figuring out what you really believe and found some promises of God that are going to hold you up when life gets hard, then you can crumble under the weight of all of that. And so I think the idea is, when you're under pressure, you need to make sure that you have prepared for how you're going to present yourself in that moment as a person who doesn't want to crumble. You want to have something to land on that's solid. And for me, that turned out to be God's promises and the faithfulness that he had shown, when I was in the Iraq War and when I'd gone through other hard things before. And it turned out to be true when we lost a son.
I'm thinking about how we prepare. I think some would think, I have certainly been here before. I don't know that I would call it preparation, but sometimes we think we're being responsible by fearing so much, by trying to just control circumstances, trying to preempt outcomes, as if, I'm going to be so diligent to at least minimize collateral damage. But that fight-flight response isn't actually good for our hearts or our minds.
No.
So the kind of preparation you're talking about is something altogether different. Speak to that, if you would.
Yeah, so I think it's not the idea that, oh boy, life's going to be really hard, so I better not get my hopes up too much. It's not that. It's to say, we prepare for all kinds of things in our lives. We prepare for what we're going to do if we have a flat tire. Everybody learns how to change a tire. We prepare for how to give somebody CPR if they have a heart attack. And we prepare for, in elementary school, they teach you what to do if you catch on fire, right? Stop, drop, and roll. You have a plan for all those things, even though most of them aren't likely to happen. But Jesus promised us in John 16:33, in this world, you're going to have trouble. He tells us in John 10:10, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. So it's true, and it's inevitable that we're going to have some hard times. And so what the wise, discerning person, especially a follower of Christ, is going to say is, well, what does God have to say to me about what I need to do when things get really hard? And part of that for me is remembering that I'm not the only person who's ever suffered. And I can look around and see how other faithful people have handled their sufferings and what they've been able to hold on to when life gets hard. And then I can remember, if you look at the book of Lamentations and David and Asaph all through the Psalms, you can see what people do when they're hurting. And what they do is they look back and they remember and they say, well, the last time something really terrible happened, God got me through it. And he was faithful and he was close to me when I was brokenhearted, and he did answer my prayers, and he did carry me through that time. So therefore I can hope that he'll do that again this time, so that I don't have to spend that time fearing that he won't hold me up this time. And I think that's a subtle difference between faith and hope. Faith is this belief that God can do the things that he says he can do. And hope is the belief that he'll do that for me too. And I think having that idea in place, that I'm going to remember that God's been faithful before, I'm going to move towards his promises, I'm going to flex that muscle of hope. Hope is not a passive thing, Susie. Hope is a verb. It's an action word. And so we can prepare our minds for the fact that when something happens that's hard, I'm going to hold on to the one who doesn't let go.
Amen. When I think about, as I've studied fear and the physiological implications of it, and even the neuro, implications and what happens in the neural pathways when you are in fight flight, when you're kind of stopped in fear and trying to plan your life around that, trying to, again, minimize collateral damage because of fear, it's playing defense, and it's so bad for you. So you think about, you have that option, or doing what you're saying is, even, I would even go far, you're the expert here, but I'm just want to add this, but when you're bent towards fear, to remember some of your good memories. To sit with God and remember beautiful moments of your life, to try to think about, and then in the hard times, here I am, I'm still standing. and the enemy
That's right.
likely has less real estate in my life. There's better things you can do with your brain when you're triggered to fear, is what I'm trying to say, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, the hippocampus is the little part of your brain that's involved in assessing a situation and retrieving a memory to try to compare it. So to get some context for what's happening. So something happens and your hippocampus says, wait, okay, this is sort of similar to this other thing that I remember. And then you basically assign meaning to that memory or to the experience that you're having, and you decide what to do with it. And the thing about the brain is what you're doing, you're getting better at. So if you've trained your brain that when you feel something like fear or pain or loss, that you're supposed to, send that straight to the amygdala and become afraid and run away or curl up into a ball or drink yourself into oblivion. If you train yourself that you're going to fire that fight, flight, freeze response, then there's a really short path from hippocampus to amygdala to stress response, to cortisol release, to the clenching of your gut as the vagus nerve fires and all of that. Or you can then attach that memory to something that says, or you can compare that current experience to a memory that says, wait, when this happened before, somebody came alongside me and I remember this verse that brought me joy and brought me peace in the moment. And you can then get your frontal lobe involved. You can find some way to hold on to some element of that that's hopeful or gracious that you can be thankful for, or find some way to give a moment of gratitude. And all of a sudden, you'll find a path through your brain to the executive function where you're able to think through that process and find a way to respond to it that doesn't involve just reacting to it. Because the switch in the hippocampus is one way. You can't be grateful and anxious at the same time. You can be one or the other.
Wow. What you're doing, you're getting better at. So what are some things a person could do that they could continually get better at that could really help them not instinctively default to panic, to fear, but in due time, they default to peace, to joy, to expectancy?
That's right. Well, I think the first thing is to remember this little phrase that we always say, feelings aren't facts. So if you train yourself to think that what you feel is always real and always accurate, then you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. Because you feel fear, you run away. You feel anxiety, you hide. You feel something that feels like betrayal, and you fight. So if you train yourself to think that feelings are always true, then you find yourself downstream reacting to something and then going, wait a minute, that wasn't actually true. I really messed that up. I created problems for myself because of how I responded to that feeling. So instead, you train yourself to remember that feelings aren't facts. They are chemical events in your brain. And so you realize that feelings are barometers, but they're not very good compasses. So they're not to navigate by, they're to check the situation and see why your brain is telling you what you're feeling and how it applies to the situation, and then how you should respond to it reasonably. So when you do that, you get this ability to call in other help, which then my help comes from the Lord. You have a second to say, wait, God, I'm feeling this. How should I respond to this? Help me, give me some tools, give me some guidance here in how I can respond to this. Because if you respond out of fear, you can't be in fear and love at the same time. Perfect love drives out fear. So if you're responding to fear, then your ability to communicate with God and his healing presence is limited and tamped down by the emotional response that you're feeling, right? So I think that the answer is to always learn to put a little pause, a little biopsy in that moment when you feel something. Before you react to it, decide if it's true or not. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it useful? Is it necessary for me to respond? Or is it more helpful for me to call in reinforcements from my great physician who's always right there and ready to help me?
So good. Just a couple minutes before break. So would you say a trauma response is an amped up emotional response? Are they kind of overlaying, or are they kind of the one and the same, except trauma maybe is even a more exaggerated emotional response, or is there a distinction?
It's probably more nuanced than that. I think a lot of times it's outside of our cognitive sort of appreciation. So if you've had a lot of traumatic experiences, or major one, even just one major one, you may have a set of physiological and psychological reactions that are not even in your consciousness, right? You may have certain things that you feel, certain things that happen in your body, sweating or anxiety or heartburn or whatever it might be, that is triggered by that thing that happened. And that's a trauma response. So I think it's not always emotional on the level of being aware that you're emotional about it. Sometimes it's more programmed. But the good news is trauma is not the thing that happened. Trauma is the responses that we have developed in response to the thing that's happened. So if you can learn to identify the way that you're responding to those traumas and recognizing other situations that trigger those responses, then you can begin to change the response into something that's more helpful to you. And that's the good news about trauma, is that it's reprogrammable. It can't stop having happened, but you can change how you respond to it.
Boy, that's so good. So when we come back, I want you to maybe unpack a little bit about how our body holds on to trauma. You've touched on it somewhat here. And then how our body best releases trauma. What's the best way? I know there are different ideas and counseling and different ways, but what you have seen from your expertise, talking to Dr. Lee Warren today about how our bodies hold on to trauma, how we can be released from it. And really, as he said, you can't change what happened, but you can now change your response. And a little bit I've known about trauma response, you can maybe have it be having a great day, and then you smell something that triggers a response from a traumatic event, or you see something or hear a song, and it's like your body reacts quicker than your brain even has a chance to. So I love that you said that, because it's not always like a cognitive emotional response to the scent or the smell. It's like your body just goes into fight, flight. So, but there's healing, there's hope for us. And Dr. Lee Warren's book is Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. And he's got an amazing podcast all about renewing your mind. It's fantastic. We'll put a link in the show notes, and we'll be back in a minute. This is Susie Larson, host of Susie Larson Live. I don't know about you, but I love consistent nourishment. I love to fast on occasion. There's a purpose in that. But if you go too long without eating on a regular basis because you're too busy, your body actually goes into crisis mode. Well, in the same way, your soul, your spirit, they need nourishment too. And that's why it's so important to be listening to scripture, listening to good teaching on a consistent basis throughout the day. That's why we're here. We love what we do, and we want to do it with you. If you listen on the radio, on the terrestrial signal, we encourage you, download our free Faith Radio app. That way, if you're traveling this season, you can take us with you wherever you go. You can catch the live shows or even the podcast after the fact, and we've made it easier than ever. All you have to do is text the word app to 877-933-2484 and then click the link. I hope you will walk with us on this journey. Greater things are yet to be done in and all around us because God, well, He's on the move. Hope you're having a really fantastic day. Thanks for tuning in to Susie Larson Live, talking to our good friend, Dr. Lee Warren. We love him so much. He's got an amazing podcast. I've turned a lot of people onto it because who doesn't need to renew their mind? You can't have a changed life without changing your mind, and he's masterful at it. We try to get him on about once a month, too, to talk about just checking our minds and our thought processes. Today, I wanted to zero in on how our body holds on to trauma. And, you know, Dr. Lee, some people know they know they have trauma, and when something triggers, they feel the visceral response. They kind of know what's going on, but there are others who maybe haven't faced maybe some of the neglect or abandonment or estrangement issues or whatever that they've walked through in past relationships, and they sort of shoved it into the basement of their souls, and so their response might come out as control. Speak to that, if you would. I mean, really, is it more of a matter of when the Lord leads them to a place where they finally admit, I need some help because I can't control my whole life forever? Or what do you do in situations like that?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Susie. You know, it's important to know. So your body doesn't store trauma; your brain does. Okay, and your brain is in charge of every aspect of your body. And surprisingly, people may not recognize this, but I'll give you an example of me personally. Like after our son died, Mitch, he was stabbed to death when he was 19. I got shingles shortly after that happened. I was a young, healthy 44-year-old guy. I've got shingles all over my back. You think that was stress related, right? So this virus that's been in my body since I had chickenpox when I was a kid came roaring out of my back and erupted in blisters and all that after I went through that experience because of my stress response was out of control. I my hair turned gray. I had a big patch of my blonde hair on the left side of my head that turned gray literally overnight. So your
Wow.
body responds to your brain and your stress hormones and your chemicals and the things that happen in your brain influence the function of your body. And that can come out in all kinds of pain syndromes and indigestion and heart rate problems and anxiety and depression and psychiatric symptoms. And it can basically overwhelm you if you're not careful. But the most important part is if you keep having certain situations make you experience certain physical things or certain psychological things or relational things, or you keep turning to a particular behavior like alcohol or something else every time you encounter something that reminds you of this experience that you had, then you have a responsibility to yourself. We call it not committing self-malpractice, right? If you're going to doctor yourself, you got to recognize at some point that this response that you have is unfortunate because you didn't cause it. But once you're aware that your body's response to this situation is harming you or harming your life or harming your relationships or harming your business, then you have a responsibility to love yourself enough to find a way to get it healed or to get it changed. Okay, friend, if you're hearing me, what I'm saying is it's not your fault that this event happened. And it's not your fault that you're experiencing these things. But once you know that trauma is not what happened to you, that trauma is the response that you have of what happened to you, that is extremely good news because your brain, you're not stuck with the brain that you have. Your brain can be changed. And the number one generator of changes in your brain are changes in your thinking. And so if we can learn to think differently about the things we've been through, then we can take charge of what's happening. We said earlier, what you're doing, you're getting better at. And unfortunately, that process is passive and active, which means if you're not actively trying to change this response, then what you're doing is making it harder and harder to change because it gets more and more automated as time goes on. So if you find yourself every time a certain song comes on the radio, you find yourself opening a bottle of alcohol to stop feeling that thing that you're feeling, then that means not just that you don't need to hear that song anymore, but you need to investigate what happened that led you to that response to that song or to that event. Does that make sense, Susie?
So much. I'm thinking of, I remember a young woman who met a man that she thought for sure was going to be the one she'd marry. And he had that. He had estrangement issues, abandonment issues in his childhood that he, kind of tried to man up, shove it down into the soul. But anytime they started to get close, he would self-sabotage and sabotage the relationship. And it was heartbreaking until he was able to finally face, I've got undealt with stuff. And I hear the compassion in your voice. And I pray if you're listening today and you've been in denial, but other people around you have been saying, no, you got a thing, you got something here that there's a path forward for you. And I just appreciate your tenderness so much. When you're talking about the primary and secondary injuries, I think this too is so important when we look at how we're holding on to trauma. I mean, you talked about it, gray hair, shingles, you said an incinerated shoulder, broken teeth, a hamstrung heart. And you said, you must understand the difference between primary and secondary injuries, and that the early post-traumatic period produces so much swelling and alteration of normal function that it's simultaneously impossible to predict the ultimate outcome and unsafe and ineffective to attempt anything other than supportive care. You're talking about, I think in that chapter you talked about not intervening too soon. I think it was a spinal or brain injury, but you're applying that to life too, that you can't right away go into fix-it mode immediately after the trauma. And yet we do that to each other. You have a loss and someone wants to give you verses and a book and all kinds of things to get you out of your trauma, and you've just been run over by a car. So maybe speak to that.
Yeah. So in neurosurgery, I'm a brain surgeon, and in neurosurgery, we have this common situation where somebody hits their head or injures their spinal cord and there's some swelling or some bleeding on the scans. And we come in to talk to the family and I'll say, we need to do surgery in about 72 hours. And inevitably they say, why not right now? You got to save grandpa or you got to save Johnny. And the answer is, if we do surgery right now, while the brain is so swollen or while the spinal cord is so swollen, we actually could make things worse. Because primary injury is the injury that suffers at the point of that you suffer at the point of impact. Like you get hit in the head with the golf club, and the neurons that get crunched are gone, and you can't fix those. They're already gone. That's the primary injury. But the problem is, Susie, things begin to swell and all kinds of cytotoxic events happen and chemicals come into the situation. And the brain starts to generate a zone of injury that puts a bunch of additional cells at risk. And if we go in and do surgery during that time when things are really vulnerable and raw and swollen, and we can actually create a bunch of neurons that would not have died that die because we intervened too early. And that's called secondary injury. So secondary injury is stuff that happens after the trauma because we didn't manage it correctly or because we went too quickly and didn't give it a chance to sort of settle down and manage it more compassionately rather than aggressively, right? Does that make sense? So how I apply that and stretch the metaphor a little bit maybe is just to say that right after your son is stabbed to death, right after your mom gets glioblastoma, right after your wife leaves, is not the time for the pastor to hand you a Timothy Keller book on walking with God in pain and suffering. It's 700 pages long, right? It's not the time for somebody to quote Romans 8:28 and tell you how God's going to use this all for good. You know, it's that moment where you're suffering. It's time to put a bandage on and stop the bleeding right then. It's time to be compassionate and rest and let people come alongside you and give you supportive care like we do in the ICU, and let that injury settle down enough that you can begin then the hard work of healing and the proper intervention at the time when you can handle it. So I think secondary injuries are these things that we generate when we don't handle the wound the way it ought to be handled and give it enough time to start setting up the healing processes that God puts in play. And so I set that out just to sort of say that not everything is appropriate at the time that it happens. So we can then, as individuals who are caring for people or loving people, our friends and family, when they're going through these hard things, we can start to say, maybe I need to close my mouth and just be there. Maybe I need to just show up and put my arms around people and love them and not necessarily try to fill the room with my voice right now or quote every scripture I can think of. And that sort of thing is how we avoid secondary injury.
What was most helpful for you when the bottom dropped out for you? What was, the folks who made a decision to just step in and to help? What was helpful?
Yeah, I think a couple of things stand out. I mean, one, obviously, I had Lisa in our family, so I wasn't alone. But then a bunch of people started showing up, and I remember one friend, Zane is his name. He's a nurse, and he was my nurse in the OR. And Zane showed up as soon as he heard about Mitch. He came to our house. He walked in and gave us a hug, and he said, "I'm going to go sit in the corner, and I'm going to be here when you need something. And I'm going to come back every day for a while. And when you need something, you tell me, and I'll take care of it." And he literally did that. He didn't tell us anything. He sat in the corner, and several times somebody would say, "Oh, we're out of water. Oh, we need toilet paper. Oh, somebody's at the airport and needs to be picked up." Zane would be, "I'm on it. I got it." And he, for 3 or 4 days, he just served and didn't talk. Wow. And, here 11 years later, that's what I remember. Like, I remember Zane showing up and helping. And that was like the most compassionate thing. And another thing that really stands out is there was a friend, it was not really a friend, a guy that was a doctor at the hospital that I knew. We didn't really have a relationship, but we knew each other. And he was kind of a burly sort of jock kind of guy, more of a mathlete, more of a chess player. And he's kind of a big orthopedic surgeon, big burly guy. And the first time I saw him in the hospital, he walked right up to me, Susie, like just broke right through that ice and walked up to me and grabbed me by the shoulders. Like, this guy, I might have never even shook his hand before. Like, we weren't friends, right? We just passed each other in the hall. And he grabbed my shoulders and he got right in my face and looked in my eyes and he said, "Lee, I don't know what to say to you. I really don't know what to say, but I care." And he shook me again and just walked off. That's all he said. And that left such a huge mark on me. Like, all he needed me to know was that he cared about it. And he wasn't equipped to give me a bunch of scriptures or tell me his favorite book on grief. He just wanted me to know that he cared. And that, I still remember his face when he said that. And so I think the punchline of those two stories is, lots of people showed up with scriptures, and lots of people showed up with God needed another angel, or God must have needed Mitch more than you did, or those kinds of things that are well-meaning, they're bad theology because people don't turn into angels, but that's another story. But they're well-meaning, but they hurt more than they help in the acute phase. They create some secondary wounds because you think things to yourself like, God must be a big bully then. Like if he can create the whole universe, and surely he could have created another angel. He didn't have to kill my son to make another angel, right? You think things like that, and it hurts. And so I think showing up, loving people, serving people, your presence more than your words is incredibly, immensely valuable.
Beautiful. I love what Zane did for you. And I love the big burly story too.
Yes.
Wow. Talking to Dr. Lee Warren today about how our bodies hold on to trauma, our brains hold on to trauma. And he corrected me truly that the brain holds on to trauma and creates physiological responses in the body. And but we want to learn about this because we want to move towards healing. Everybody needs healing from something. And as Dr. Lee has said in past shows, we can work as hard as we can to prevent a massive thing from happening. And it just does sometimes. There's not a predictable formula. We can lean in and trust God, but there are things we can do. One thing he says is prehab. We're going to talk about that on the other side. And you got a chapter titled Memory, Movement, and the Science of Hapification. We're going to learn about that, about movement, about memory, and the science of hapification. Dr. Lee Warren's my guest today. Hope is the First Dose is the title of his book. It's rich, it's deep, it's so worth having on your shelf, no matter where you find yourself in life. A treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. We'll be back in a minute. Thanks so much for tuning into Susie Larson Live, talking to our precious friend, Dr. Lee Warren, drawing from his book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. And, one of the big reasons this show exists is to help you heal from the inside out, and then to be mobilized into the high calling that God has for you. And this is just true that many, many Christians go through life staying stuck in their junk, just staying stuck in their stuff and living a life as a series of reactions to stuff, to triggers. Yet there's a better way. I mean, what Jesus won for us on the cross is so significant. It's not just eternity. If it were only that, it would be amazing. But he truly, truly, in the land of the living, wants to transform us from the inside out and has fearfully and wonderfully made us in such a way that we can change our lives today and tomorrow by renewing our minds and thinking thoughts that are redemptive and are life-giving. And Dr. Lee Warren, I'll tell you, has a podcast that talks about renewing your mind. And he's gentle. He's just brilliant. You will love it. We'll link it up in the show notes. But we've got a handful of copies of Hope is the First Dose to give away. And you can text the word book if you want in on the drawing, 877-933-2484. So Dr. Lee, you've got a chapter titled Memory, Movement, and the Science of Hapification. I got to say, I was in a good mood just after reading the word hapification. I don't know, it just cheered me right up. Talk about that chapter.
Yeah, that might be my favorite chapter in the book. It's a made up word, hapification, but basically I was this guy that was always sure it was going to be okay. I just had this sort of a happy heart. My parents, I had a good childhood, and I was raised with people of faith. And I just, even when I was in Iraq in the war and we get mortared or some horrible thing would happen, I was always the guy that was like, hey, it's going to be okay. We're going to find a way. It's going to be okay. And after I lost Mitch, Susie, it wasn't okay anymore for me. And I don't know how to say it without sort of sounding like hyperbole, but it just didn't feel okay. Like my life no longer had that flavor of being good. And for a while, and Lisa and I would talk about it, and it just didn't taste good anymore, my life. And it was hard for me after a while, after that acute injury settled down. And I realized that like things would happen that should be producing great joy. Like my first book came out, No Place to Hide, about 8 or 9 months after Mitch died. And that's a time when you should be jumping up and down and super excited. And hey, I've got a book coming out, major publisher and all this stuff. And it was just sort of like noted. It was just sort of, yeah, that's great. My book came out. I wasn't happy anymore. And a lot of Christians have this idea that we're not supposed to worry about happiness because we got this joy, this sort of, eternal thing. Our eyes are on the redemption and all that. And that's true. But the word that Jesus uses in the Beatitudes when he says, blessed are the poor and all that, that word blessed is makarios in the Greek. It's Asher in the Hebrew. And it actually means happy. And what it means is that if we have God, we can be happy. And happiness doesn't mean that we have all the things that we want, or we, get all the money or get the fancy cars or whatever. It means that we have something that can't be taken from us when life gets hard. And we have something that will hold us up and make us joyful. That's what happy really means. And I didn't have it anymore. It took me a while to figure out that that's what I was missing. And the truth is, I needed some way to find my way back to that, because my life, I was still living. I had a great family, and I had a beautiful wife and an incredible career and all that, but it just didn't taste good anymore. And I think a lot of the listeners will resonate with that, because when something really hard happens, it changes the flavor of your life, right? And I started going to scripture, because that's kind of what I was trained to do by my parents, is to go when life gets hard, go to the word, and God will show you something. And I found 3 places, Lamentations and 2 Psalms, one by Asaph and one by David, where there's a story of somebody who's in a horrible situation and they lose hope. And then they start doing 2 things. And I saw it in all 3 of these places. The 2 things that they do are remember the other times when things have been hard and God turned out to be faithful. And then they move towards some way to reconnect with that promise. Eugene Peterson said, hope commits us to actions that connect us to God's promises. Hope commits us to actions that connect us to God's promises. That was in his book, Run with the Horses, which is look at Jeremiah's life. So I'm reading Lamentations, and I see the lamenter, maybe Jeremiah, whoever wrote it, and he's in the middle of this horrible story in chapter 3 of a 5-chapter story that's terrible, when the whole world is on fire, basically. And he says, I've forgotten what hope is. I don't know what hope is anymore. I've lost all hope, but this I know, and therefore I have hope. And he reminds himself, he remembers the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. He talks himself back into hope and decides to move forward in connection with that promise, right? And Asaph does the same thing. David does the same thing. And what I realized is they don't change their mind after they judge how God responded and got them out of the situation. They change their mind in the middle of the situation, because they know that God's going to get them through it. And they know that that's how they can find their peace again, is by connecting to God's promise, regardless of the outcome. Like, God's plan is good for you. God's plan is good for me. And it may not look like I think it's going to look, because I can tell you to this day, I didn't think it was going to look like having a son in the ground, Susie. But God has shown me that I can have a valuable piece, a life of purpose and meaning and joy and happiness. Anyway, Lisa and I found our way back to that. Our kids and our grandkids have found their way back to that in spite of having lost Mitch. And in fact, having lost him in some ways has redefined my life in a way that is in some ways more meaningful than it was before, because it wasn't all about knowing who my Redeemer was then, and it certainly is now. So this word hapification, I just basically said, I need to find that again, that thing that I felt, and I always knew it was going to be okay. And I found it in remembering and moving, and I called that hope. That's how you find hope, and that's a biblical model of creating hope when it seems to be none to be found.
So much I want to say. It's such a beautiful, honest portrayal of your journey. And I'm thinking of that you got to a place that only God could get you there, but it's hard work on your part as well, cooperating with God and renewing your mind. And as you say, flexing the muscle of hope before you see any kind of breakthrough, because you have reason for hope. And as you say, the title of your book, Hope is the First Dose. Somehow, some way, by some miracle, not only are you on your feet again, are you praising God? Are you showing up to love your wife and your family, and showing up to care for your patients, and showing up on your podcast to minister to thousands of people? But you actually can stay standing here. God, your Redeemer lives, and he's even redeemed this unbelievable tragedy. What I just want listeners to know and hear and think about is, when it first happened, for someone to come and tell you God's going to work it all together for the good is so premature, even though that's a truth, it's just not what a person can hear at that moment of trauma. But as you're walking it out, I mean, we have to somehow practice restraint and suspend our assessments when people are in utter trauma and intercede however God leads. But then to be in awe of, look what God has done and look how he's used your pain. But that's your story to tell, your story, your journey to walk, and your testimony to make. And I mean, I don't even know if I'm making sense, but I'm in awe of what God has done. But it also makes me realize those suffering spaces immediately after trauma is holy ground. And we better not speak unless we're sure God wants us to say something. Any thoughts?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. It's interesting. There's a verse I think it's in Hebrews where he says, all God's promises are irrevocable, right? God's promise and his oath are irrevocable, and it's impossible for him to lie. And so if the Bible says that God will work all things together for the good, for those that love him and are called according to his purpose, this next verse says to conform you to Christ. So that means that process of making something good out of something horrible is going to be for the purpose of conforming you to Christ. And Christ, by the way, his story included being nailed to a cross, right? So he had some massive things in his life too. So I think the point of that is I can look back now with the gift of 11 years of time, and I can honestly say that some tremendously good things have come from losing my son. And I always have to say it. I always have to parse this out. Don't hear me saying, I realize now that it was good that I lost my son. That is not true, and it will never be true. I would trade all of this, Susie. I would trade this conversation and everything that's happened for him to be alive again in a heartbeat. But what I mean is, God has molded and shaped and conformed me to Christ in ways that I could never have achieved without having gone through that furnace of suffering. He has changed my family. He's changed my marriage. He's changed my career and the way I look at and value my work. And 2 times since we lost Mitch, I've received emails from people around the world who said, I was going to kill myself today until I read your newsletter. Today was the day I was going to commit suicide until I heard your podcast. And now I have hope and I'm not going to kill myself. So 2 people at least are alive out there who would not be alive if I hadn't found the words to explain how we move forward after we lost our son. So is that a good thing?
Wow.
That is an immensely good thing, right? But it's not good that I lost my son. So we have to hold these 2 truths in tension with one another, that it's never good. God doesn't want suffering to happen in the world. Suffering is a result of the fall, which is a result of sin. It was not his plan, but he doesn't want those things to happen to you. But he has a plan and process to redeem us from those things, and he will work all of it out in some time, in some way that is good for you. And so those are the 2 truths that I have to hold as a bereaved parent in my hands at the same time, and they never stop being equally true.
Somebody needs to text me an amen. If you needed to hear what Dr. Lee just said, why don't you just text me 877-933-2484. Always helps me to know if this is resonating with you, if it's speaking to you. I really know and believe it is. So we go to break here. I want to read this from Dr. Lee's book. Life is a series of beautiful moments interspersed by great trials. The trick to be happy is to learn to have beautiful moments during the trial. Faith isn't a belief that God will spare you from problems. It's a belief that he's still God and will carry you through those problems. When we come back, if we have time, I want to talk about the 4 kinds of people, the 4 categories you describe: untouchables, climbers, dippers, and crashers. And also how you can have someone walk through something, come through the other side, and they're completely eroded. Someone else go through something far worse and come through it, and they're shining bright as the sun. What's the difference? What do we need to know about that so that we can navigate the trials that we are walking through? I'm so glad you're listening today. Dr. Lee Warren is my guest, drawing from his amazing story and his book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. We'll be back in a minute. This is Susie Larson, host of Susie Larson Live. Solitude is one thing, loneliness another. We can enjoy rich times with God in solitude, yet we can be in a large crowd and feel all alone. It all depends on the season we're in. and the perspective we embrace. Maybe, just maybe, you're walking through a season where nobody quite understands what you're walking through. Well, friend, you know what? Jesus knows. You're never alone. Even so, every one of us needs encouragement on this journey. We would love to encourage you today. If you need some texts of audio encouragement, we would love to send those to you. Text the word lonely to 877-933-2484. Again, text the word lonely to 877-933-2484. Want you to be reminded that you're not alone. He is with you. We're with you too. Connecting faith to life, Faith Radio. Thanks so much for tuning into Susie Larson Live, talking to our friend Dr. Lee Warren, drawing from his story and his book, Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. And just really looking at how do we get through trials, traumas, large and small. Sometimes there's an accumulation of small traumas that seem so small to you that you disregard them, but they're still impacting you. They still impact how you react to life. And yet God wants to heal us from the inside out. And he won't do that without our partnership. We need to cooperate with him. We do need to renew our minds. And that's why Dr. Lee Warren is just a favorite to get on every month to talk about renewing of our minds. Just with the few minutes we have left, you described, I must have missed this other times when I've prepped to have you on the show, the untouchables, the dippers, the crashers, and the climbers. Talk about those, if you would, and just our responses to the massive things that happen to us.
Yeah, so I was trying, this actually came out of the work and research that I was doing when I wrote my second book, I've Seen the Interview. And then I was basically dealing with these people with malignant brain cancers and uncurable neurological illnesses. And I was trying to figure out how to doctor people when I couldn't fix them with surgery, how to help them find hope and help them manage their lives, even when I couldn't fix them. And so I started studying, and I noticed that there's these repeatable patterns that I broke into 4 categories. There's more. And I think the truth is most people are not solidly one type or the other, but we all are maybe a blend of them. But I noticed these 4 patterns that kept showing up. And the most confounding one to me was these people that I called untouchables. And they were these folks that would have been able to tell you before something happened that if something happened, they would be fine because they knew what they believed and they knew who God was and they had things figured out. And then when they get the diagnosis, they just never waver and they seem to just plow right through it. They hold on to their faith and hope and nothing ever seems to shake them, and they're untouchable. And then there's another group that is also not the most common one, but it's very tragic. And these people I call crashers, and they're people that would have said, yeah, I believe in God and I'm faithful and I know everything's going to be okay. And then as soon as something hard happens, Susie, they just crash. They lose everything. They doubt, they fear, they turn into a shell of their former selves. And the scary thing about these folks is that some of them don't die from their illness, but they never get back to something that looks like the kind of life that they had before. Mm-hmm. You probably know this person, like somebody that lost somebody 20 years ago or had cancer 20 years ago, and they're still just embittered and outraged or stuck, and they can't heal and they can't move on. If you bump into them in the street and you say, how are you doing today? They'll say, well, my mom died 12 years ago and I just can't get over it. Like those people crash and they don't come alive again, even if their body doesn't die. And then there's a group that I think is the most common. I think I'm this way, the people that we call dippers. They hit something hard and it kind of wipes them out, and they fall into that Chris Voss thing that we talked about earlier. They fall to their highest level of preparation, and they figure out that the things that they thought they believed really are true, and they can land on something solid, and they don't wipe out. They fall for a while, but they find their feet again, and their life becomes different than it was before, but it still has a lot of purpose and meaning and passion and hope and even happiness again. It just looks different, right? So they crash a bit, but they land on something solid and they find their way back. And the most surprising group, the group that I think is the most stunning, this speaks to our God's mercy, is what I call climbers. These are people that didn't have anything to hold on to or to believe in or have faith in until something hard happened. And the story I tell in the book is a guy named Joey, who was a down and out guy. His mom had died when he was born, and his dad abandoned him, and he was, basically a drug addict. And he was actually injured in a fight with DEA agents that ended up having a skull fracture when I met him. And I took him to surgery to fix a skull fracture, and I noticed something funny in his brain, and I decided to take it out because it looked like it was damaged tissue. It turned out to be brain tumor. And so he's injured in this altercation, and we find this brain tumor that we resect and have a chance to cure him before it became really horribly malignant. So it's kind of good news out of bad news, right? So I tell him in the recovery room, hey, you've got brain cancer. And he basically was like, of course I do. You know, my whole life's been horrible. Why wouldn't I have brain cancer? Yeah, he had nothing. And yet over the course of his illness, as he got sick from his brain cancer showing up a few months later, he met somebody, fell in love. He found a chaplain that befriended him and introduced him to Jesus, and he ended up getting saved. And he came alive, got his GED, like he turned his whole life around. And shortly before he died, Susie, he said, "This has been the best year of my life." Like he came alive in response to the hard thing that he faced. And so those are the four types of people that I noticed. And the question is, so knowing that people have a response to hard things, it behooves us then to develop a plan for trying to make sure that we're in a category that will help us and not hurt us when we face that hard thing. That's why I came up with the idea of let's have a treatment plan. Let's have a plan in place for what we're going to do when life gets hard so we don't crash.
With that, we're wrapping today's show. Dr. Lee, this has been so helpful. I feel like every time I have you on, we have a brand new conversation. This is such a deep and rich topic. Thank you, my friend. We appreciate your time so much.
Thank you, Susie. God bless you. Thank you.
And you as well. Again, we'll link up Dr. Lee's podcast in the show notes. I pray you found some encouragement here today. Pray you hear the whisper of the Lord to just invite you on the path of healing, redemption, restoration, and that you put good things in your heart and mind so that you're standing strong, whether the storms rage or whether they don't. Thanks for tuning in today, and we will meet you back here next time. Thanks for listening to Susie Larson Live. Podcasts like mine are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes and give now.